Okay, here we go. So we'll be kind of going over Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton, which came out in 1970. It's his autobiography, largely focused on his time uh, with the Black Panther Party, which he co-founded. So, quick overview of who Huey was. So, he was the co-founder, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which was based out of Oakland, in California. So the party was organized around Marxist-Leninist, anti-imperialist, and Black Power lines, and it was honestly one of the most successful working-class organizations in the U.S. during its time. Um, and some of their programs and activities included armed police patrols, community defense, funding bail and legal fees, and sort of lawyers for people in their communities. Lots of political literature, including their magazine, and free education for folks, so they could anything from like learning their rights, just here's how you interact with cops, and here's how just basic stuff that basically is completely lacking in the American education system. And then of course all of their really famous survival programs. So this is where they would have um, food programs for people, like the free lunch program for children. I think it was called something like that.
Hmm.
It's particularly one of the examples of it being a smashing success. So yeah, the Black Panther Party, pretty darn cool. And here is their 10-point program. So we can kind of just go through this and discuss. So they kind of Huey and uh, Bobby
Bobby Seale.
Seal. Yeah, I was like, there's two Bobbies. Make sure I get the right one. Yeah, Bobby Seal. I'm pretty sure they both basically worked on it and banged this out in like one evening, one sitting, which is pretty cool too. So number one, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black and oppressed communities. Subpoint, we believe that black and oppressed people will not be free until we are able to determine our destinies in our own communities ourselves by fully controlling all the institutions which exist in our communities.
I know it's soon to interject, but I would like to highlight and emphasize the fact that he said black and oppressed communities,
It's actually
which,
surprised.
yes, includes the unhoused, gender and sexual minorities, and all sorts of things. Yes, they might have had some problematic stuff, but or he himself anyway. But he hit it right on the fucking head in the beginning. He didn't just say black; he said black and oppressed, which I think was a very deliberate choice.
It is, and there's even a section um, where he specifically talks about they were trying to ally themselves, or actually, it might have been they were trying to merge. I think they're trying to kind of combine forces with another group, which I'm forgetting the name of, but the other group basically was like kind of like what you were just hinting at, right? Like they're like way too gung ho of like we're basically a party that is only considering the needs of black people, and that's it. And the Black Panthers, on the other hand, were like, well, hey, like we deal with all kinds of people all the time, including and including some people who are. He actually often mentions like young white people in universities, especially
Yes.
who are like
Well,
super fucking radical. So he's like, there's no
their
reason we shouldn't work with those people.
also their school lunch program wasn't just for impoverished and disenfranchised black children. It was for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was a line along which they disagreed with um, other organizations, and it's pretty clear that is the correct line is broaden your
Mhm.
scope a little more than just like
Yeah,
a
and
specific
Universal.
group.
if you're
Uni-
familiar with Oakland and the culture there, the Hmong people, it is incredibly ethnically diverse. So it is impossible that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton didn't see these communities and didn't see parallel mechanisms of oppression right there in their own neighborhoods.
Yes, and also the fact that universal programs tend to have universal support. Why every time you see if it weren't for that, then we would have already lost, for example, Social Security. If that was like simply a program based on racial lines or something, then it probably would have lost because it wouldn't have had broad-based popular support. Uh, yes. It turns out that when you are all inclusive in your movement, then you tend to bring in people who may not necessarily agree with your overall, you know, uh, views on society, but if they're all benefiting from your programs, then those programs will be popular. And popular programs tend to be harder to assault on a state level.
Yeah. And then I think just on the other part of point one that they lay out is, I mean, it's simple in its language, but obviously is a very impactful point, right? Which is controlling all the institutions which exist in our communities. And it is nice to hear. You hear a little bit of that sort of language in more recent times, especially like in 2020, in some of the George Floyd protests. Like there was calls for like, shit, we're burning stuff down, and but that shit ain't ours. I
Mhm.
mean, we don't own any of this.
Why are they burning down their own? That speech by that black woman who said like we don't own shit. Like
That's
I
right.
forget what her name was, but yeah, she was like we're not burning down our own community. We're burning down the basically the colonial footholds within our communities because we have colonized the entire world, right? And so a lot of colonialism now, since there are no, new geographical, new nations to expand into, I mean, we can try, but a lot of them have either taken aside or simply resist our efforts. So what do? They colonize our own, existing communities. That's what gentrification is. That's what putting a fucking Walmart in the middle of an impoverished community and undermining all of the local businesses. That's what that is. That is colonialism turned inward. And you know what we call that? Fascism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, when you have this colonialism turned inward, and somebody's burning down a fucking Target in a like majority black neighborhood. That's not burning down their community. That's rejecting and resisting a different form of imperialism.
Exactly. And it's good to see that even though not obviously not all people are going to even agree with this, but I think it is actually widely internalized by many, many, many people. Like you don't really have to press very hard for them to basically admit, like, yeah, I guess you're right. Like, all that private property, it's not ours, right? And as soon as you threaten it, you are immediately in the scopes of a cop. Like, probably the
Mhm.
nearest cop is on your ass quickly. Um, yeah, because that's their role. All right,
Yes.
let's do number two. We want full employment for our people. We believe that the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every person employment or a guaranteed income. We believe that if the American businessmen will not give full employment, then the technology and means of production should be taken from the businessmen and placed in the community, so that the people of that community can organize and employ all of its people and give a high standard of living. There's the Marxism Leninism. So yeah, that's pretty much just without using any of, I mean, other than like means of production, I guess. Pretty much, this is basically just the thesis statement of like like a basic understanding of socialism without using any of that loaded language that would probably set most people off. Kind of like the old man was just saying, like a tact that we should probably also begin learning is like, yes, we can read theory and internalize it and learn a lot from it, but if we just start regurgitating theory at people, it's probably going to be taken the same way as most regurgitation, very poorly. Just simply rewording it in a way like, for example, full employment, which implies a guaranteed income, and I mean, he's using essentially, collective ownership of the means of production, right? Yes, this is like one of the commonalities of all threads of socialism, but he's not really using that language, and I think he's putting it in a way that's hopefully super easy to understand for almost anybody. And yeah, it's basically the community owns all the stuff, everyone's employed, and we work together to provide a high standard of living for everyone. That's pretty much it. And I think that's a simple, clear message that I would hope most people could get behind. Because like the old man said, you don't want to lead with you don't want your opening statement to be trying to convince people on like violent revolution. Maybe get to that later.
Yeah, I forget exactly what the source was, but Lenin was critiquing a scholar for showing up at a labor meeting and just using, overly verbose terms and concepts rather than, speaking directly to the people in terms that they understand and things that real people can get behind.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, number 3. We want an end to the robbery by the capitalist of our black and oppressed communities. We believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. 40 acres and 2 mules were promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The American racist has taken part in the slaughter of over 50 million black people, and therefore we feel this is a modest demand that we make. This is kind of another demand that has gotten a little more traction in recent years. I think nowadays this would fall under the category of basically demands for reparations. And yeah, it's interesting that they threw that in there. I mean, it kind of makes sense. And they're the infamous sort of 40 acres and 2 mules for every... Is it every person or every family? I don't remember the exact language.
For every freed man.
Every free man, yeah. So probably the women were just shit out of luck, probably.
But it also included a concessionary thing for white men who had also participated in the liberation of the South. So it wasn't just for black people. In fact, some of those reparations were universal. And unfortunately, Adam Johnson became president and put a stop to all of that. But had they gone through, probably would have been extremely popular.
Not to mention extremely beneficial for the country, because as we know, when you provide people with resources to lift themselves up, it lifts up everyone and everything around them.
Something developing productive forces. Yeah.
Yeah, and 40 acres that's a lot of fucking land.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of fucking land that is very, very much still in the government's possession. Or I would wager that every time the government sells land, it's 9.999 times out of 10, it's probably to a giga corporation that's buying it for probably oil extraction nowadays, maybe agriculture, although kind of doubt it. I'm sure back then, yeah, probably agriculture would have been more common, but yeah. So yeah, that's our demand around reparations. Number 4, we want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings. We believe that if landlords will not give decent housing to our black and oppressed communities, then the housing and the land should be made into cooperatives so that the people in our communities, with government aid, can build and make decent housing for the people. Again, super simple demand. Even including the basically we'll build it ourselves. Just give us the fucking resources, right? It's not asking for the oft maligned handout, right? It's like, no, fuck that. We'll do it ourselves. We just want the resources to build our own housing that's like fucking awesome to live in, even if it is like the large public housing like apartments in Vienna, for example, right? Which I know is a popular example of like a very successful public housing project. It's like it can be done correctly, and in a way that really does benefit a great number of people, and provide excellent housing. It's just always like, what's it called, kneecapped in the U.S. It feels like public housing projects, that is. Even when they do, I mean, shit. It's like you're nowadays. I feel like we're lucky if that even gets approved in the first place. But even if it does, it gets fucking, bare fucking minimum funding. So that it's like the shittiest quality housing you could possibly get away with.
Most people in office and politics are landlords. Most people own rental or commercial property. They have a direct financial benefit to not make public housing.
Yeah, even if they're not landlords that are seeking rent, they're probably landowners, right? Maybe they at least own their own property, I would assume, and then that's why they're NIMBYs, right? That's the acronym, right? Basically the assumption is that if public housing goes up in the same housing market as I am, then suddenly the value of my house has declined. Therefore, I'm losing money. So yeah, housing as an investment vehicle is a huge fucking like roadblock to any sort of public housing. So it's man, this point is like one of the most frustrating, I think, to discuss. I know in my situation, several of my friends who are still hardcore libs are like, this is a part that's so hard to make any ground on, right? They could agree with basic principles of social justice all day long, but as soon as you get to housing, wow, the reactionary response is so disappointing.
Scratch a liberal.
Yeah, I know. It's like, man, as soon as you start coming for private property, people lose their goddamn minds. Very sad. But, yeah. Ultimately, a simple and humane demand is apparently too much for most people. Very sad. Got to work on that stuff.
Sure do.
I find if you're talking to liberals about the dangers of landlording, one of the most helpful points is to talk about the dangers of eviction and the harm that eviction causes, and put it to them like, hey, if you're a landlord and you have to choose between your profits and putting somebody on the street, somebody who has a higher chance of dying, like, what's your choice? Like, and if that's your choice not to put somebody on the street, then why landlord in the first place?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some. I would say your approach to arguing for something like point 4 is probably going to depend on your audience, because I'm sure that argument you just brought up would convince some people, but there's probably others who are just so vicious they'd be like, yeah, fuck them, I'll throw them on the street if they're not paying rent, right? Like, there are pieces of shit like that, 110%.
I unfortunately know quite a few.
Mm-hmm. I'll keep going here. Number 5. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in present-day society. We believe in an educational system that will give to our people a knowledge of self. If you do not have knowledge of yourself and your position in the society and the world, then you will have little chance to know anything else. So, yeah, I mean, it's a little open-ended. But it is certainly something that was missing at the time and is largely still missing, I'd say, today. Like I guess I'll just use my own my own experience as an example, but I was very lucky, I think, when I took U.S. history in high school, that my teacher she did her master's, in U.S. history, but she like specifically focused on like, slaveholding practices in Virginia, like in the 1840s or whatever the fuck it was. So she was like incredibly knowledgeable on like a lot of American history that I know many of my peers were like, wait, what? I didn't learn any of that stuff. So unfortunately, in your average American education system, yeah, you're as he says, like, exposing the true nature of American society. The picture of American society that most people are taught in America is really fucking distorted. So, yeah, it's a pretty powerful demand, and I think in the book he does talk about this is also one of the demands that the party was actually able to tackle itself, by the Black Panther Party actually hosting, basically just free classes basically for the community where this is what their mission was, right? They would teach people about their true history, and their role in present day society. So that probably I would assume implies basically teaching more class consciousness to people, right? Because that's, for a fact that's not taught in a typical public school system. And yeah, knowledge of self, and just like we were talking about before we started recording, where typically like the Paula Freire quote you brought up, right? Where the public education system basically is assuming students are sort of these empty vessels to just fill with propaganda and ideology, and then you ship them out to go get maybe to university, where the same process continues for the most part. But basically, once they're done with their schooling as a whole, they get plugged into the machine as the next cog, and any sort of deviation is no bueno.
Yeah,
I'm done.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say something that when I had the unique pleasure to see Bobby Seale speak, that he mentioned about including in educational programs, was work skills, and it's not specifically mentioned, but he talked about introducing work skills as a way of preventing specifically, military recruitment and getting caught up in a cog in the machine, and being able to provide, resources and support to your own community by gaining work skills through education.
Yeah, no, I think that's very valuable as well. Like, I was actually just over this last holiday talking with my mom, and she was actually, apparently when she was a kid, like, they were teaching classes about like, oh, here's how you take care of your car, like here's how you change your own oil and replace filters and like change a tire, and basically just, it was kind of mandatory, it seemed like, to like just learn basic life skills, like you're talking about, sort of very practical And I'm like, that was completely fucking non-existent when I was in school.
Yeah, I believe that was the basis of like home economics.
Home ec is a thing still, but I I was almost, I didn't take it, but I'm almost positive it was like lots of cooking and like
Oh, it
house
eventually
care.
evolved into a very patriarchal and
Yeah,
misogynistic kind of
that was 100% my.
women, but the original intent
Mhm.
behind it, while also probably having roots in like patriarchal society and a lot of other bad things, but
Yeah,
it was also simply to give people the necessary skills to have a functioning self-sufficient life.
right.
And of
Yeah,
course, over time, as things progress, it became more and more of just like a reactionary, oh, this is where women belong kind of thing, which is what is kind of the modern context in which it is both
hmm,
taught and viewed.
yeah, definitely. And oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, according to her, it wasn't actually part of a class. It was actually just like everyone meet by the gym, and like Bill's dad is gonna show everyone how to like change the oil on a truck or some shit like that.
Yeah.
I was like, man, that sounds like it'd been a fun fucking day at school, but shit.
Hmm. You mean to say that it arose organically outside of the structure of the state, almost like mutual aid is a factor of human evolution?
I know.
There's no profit incentive though.
Well, that's probably why it got fucking canceled eventually. They're like, you know what? Even though this is a 100% free thing that we don't have to pay a dime for, we'd
Yes,
rather have
because
citizens who are completely incapable of performing basic tasks and they have to pay for services to
exactly.
stimulate the
Because,
local economy.
If
And
everybody
also
fixed their
join
vehicle,
the local join the U.S. military and serve the imperialists.
and if everybody knows how to fix their own vehicle, then you inherently are diminishing the profits of, for example, mechanics.
Yeah. And there are so many goddamn mechanics, at least in
Oh
the
my God.
U.S. Like, I know
So
if there's any Euros who are still awake at this hour, you may not be able to understand, like, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a fucking auto repair shop in the U.S., I swear to God. All right. Number 6.
Church or mechanic, take your pick.
Yeah, I guess you'd hit one or the other. That's fair. Bonus points if you hit them and they're in the same building. Okay, number 6. We want completely free health care for all black and oppressed people. We believe that the government must provide, free of charge, for the people, health facilities which will not only treat our illnesses, most of which have come about as a result of our oppression, but which will also develop preventative medical programs to guarantee our future survival. We believe that mass health education and research programs must be developed to give all black and oppressed people access to advanced scientific and medical information so we may provide ourselves with proper medical attention and care. Yay, something else that should be a basic human right, but instead is a basic human demand.
or worse, commodified.
Yeah, it is very much commodified. But yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, that demand, if this sentence, if this, or what, if these 3 sentences were written literally yesterday, I don't think any of us would be able to tell. Truly. I mean, I don't think anything has changed since 1970 on this front, unfortunately. In fact, it's
Yeah,
probably,
that's just
if I had to
disappointing.
guess, it's probably worse, but
Even my
I also didn't grow up
even
in the
my
70s.
hardcore even my hardcore reactionary mom is in line with this one.
It's honestly hard to find people who are like, unironically, like, yes, I love health insurance. I mean, like, they'd have to be an actual demon to like to love talking to health insurance companies on the phone, arguing about insane billing practices and
I mean, to be
fees.
fair, it took going through cancer for her to flip on this, but
Oof.
she's there now,
Yeah.
and she's fine. But
That's good.
All right. Next 3. Number 7. We want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people, other people of color, and all oppressed people inside the United States.
Once again, I cannot help but stress enough how he repeatedly says, and other oppressed people.
Exactly. He says, we believe that the racist and fascist government of the United States uses its domestic enforcement agencies to carry out its program of oppression against black people, other people of color, and poor people inside the United States. We believe it is our right, therefore, to defend ourselves against such armed forces, and that all black and oppressed people should be armed for self-defense of our homes and communities against these fascist police forces. Yeah, this is the point in the program that the Panthers were basically able to enact pretty much on day one by arming themselves and conducting police monitoring patrols, basically, right? Where they would actually just drive around totally randomly, it sounded like, was their methodology.
Yes, they would drive around and they would specifically pursue cop cars. And basically, if the cop pulled somebody over, they would pull over with them, and they kept literature on them about your civil rights, about legal information, and contact numbers for civil rights attorneys, and all sorts of good practical information for the person being pulled over. And they were armed when they did it.
Oops. And actually, one of the funniest stories from the book is where when Huey does this, like they pull up on a cop like harassing some guy for whatever reason, and whatever the cop was like trying to frame him for, basically, Huey just busted out his like one of the law books he had, and very loudly and publicly started basically shouting the legal code for all to hear, which is totally legal. so that the dude being harassed knew what was what, right? He knew exactly like the deal, and realized, hey, wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. You're all just fucking harassing me for no reason. And of course the cops left because they were suddenly, they had no leverage.
And not just that, but telling them that, hey, you don't have to comply with these people. You don't have to talk to these people. If they don't have like a signed warrant from a judge for your arrest, you can literally tell them to fuck off.
Well, I heard initially that they weren't armed and they just had their books and they were just doing this, and that they would regularly just get their ass beat by police. And then they realized, hey, California law says we can be armed and we should be doing this with shotguns.
I'm pretty sure they were armed almost from Jump Street. Like,
yeah, like after having once, they probably went to it.
Yeah, and they would tell the people in their communities, like, yeah, you should, like, do you have a weapon, basically? And they might say yes or no, and they'd be like, just so you know, like, you're allowed to open carry. And it really does like make cops think twice, basically. And then they would also, like, they even printed a specific booklet, which was like a super compressed version of like your basic civil rights, and like a quick kind of like what you're supposed to do if the police mess with you. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like it'd be very nice to have, honestly. I'm sure we could probably track that document down, actually. If anyone wants to look for that really fast and pop in the chat, that'd be sick, actually. Because I think he mentioned having some little just like 1-page pamphlet or something they would pass out in the community to like explain things to people, which is also very good.
Of course, if you tried to do that today, you would probably be murdered by the police.
Or at least be a persona non grata. Yeah. You're talking about the part where you just yell like legal codes in the open?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that I'm sure you'd make enemies straight away. Okay. Number 8, we want an immediate end to all wars of aggression. We believe that the various conflicts which exist around the world stem directly from the aggressive desires of the U.S. ruling circle and government to force its domination upon the oppressed people of the world. We believe that if the U.S. government or its lackeys do not cease these aggressive wars, that it is the right of the people to defend themselves by any means necessary against their aggressors. So we got a nice little moment of some international solidarity, which is nice to see. Yeah, not much else to say on that, to be honest. Pretty straightforward. Number 9, we want freedom for all black and poor oppressed people now held in U.S. federal, state, county, city, and military prisons and jails. We want trials by a jury of peers for all persons charged with so-called crimes under the laws of this country. We believe that the many black and poor oppressed people now held in U.S. prisons and jails have not received fair and impartial trials under a racist and fascist judicial system and should be free from incarceration. We believe in the ultimate elimination of all wretched, inhuman penal institutions, because the masses of men and women imprisoned inside the U.S. or by the U.S. military are the victims of oppressive conditions, which are the real cause of their imprisonment. We believe that when persons are brought to trial, that they must be guaranteed by the U.S. juries of their peers, attorneys of their choice, and freedom from imprisonment while awaiting trials. So yeah, this is basically a demand for much more equal civil rights. And I also mentioned, just in case you did not read the book, that Huey had a very interesting full perspective on what he believed to be a jury of his peers. Now, he used the example of when he was arrested for stabbing a guy, and he basically was saying how the guy was essentially threatening him for whatever reason, and Huey's immediate reaction was basically, oh, this dude's gonna attack me any second now, so I need to get the jump on him, which I think was indeed the case. But he got the jump on the guy, and the guy wasn't able to counterattack. So, and he basically was arguing that anybody in his community would have understood the situation and understood immediately that it was a clear-cut case of self-defense. But Huey was not judged by a jury of his peers. He was judged by a jury of rich white people from the other side of the bay.
Of course.
Who didn't give a fuck about any sort of anything going on. They didn't know anything about his personal community. And so it's he couldn't possibly have convinced them of his innocence in the situation of acting in self-defense. So of course he got chucked in prison, which I thought it definitely was an interesting perspective, and I think it makes sense. I think if you're going to have any sort of legal penal system under capitalism or socialism, really, because even in socialism I think you'd have to have something analogous to that, an actual jury of your actual peers does make sense. In other words, people who grew up in very similar conditions to you, if not literally the same community. I mean, that seems to be the spirit of that sort of language. It really doesn't make sense for a group of wealthy, or even if they're not that wealthy, a group of white people who have absolutely no idea about Huey's context at the time. it just kind of makes sense. So yeah, definitely an interesting demand. And also, yeah, I think this definitely follows with some of the, prison abolition movements that were sort of getting started at the time. They're not explicitly calling. He does say the ultimate elimination of all wretched, inhuman penal institutions. So it's not like a blanket call for all prison abolition, not necessarily, but definitely the abolition of most prisons would fall under what he calls wretched, inhuman penal institutions. That's pretty much all of them in the U.S. So, effectively, prison abolition is what they're calling for. And at the very least, a more legit version of due process, since due process in this country is kind of a joke most of the time. All right, number 10, last one. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and people's community control of modern technology. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth there's the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security.
I just want to say how much of a fucking Chad move it was to invoke the same language from the Declaration of Independence there?
I think that's Declaration.
Yeah. Let me
Yeah.
check.
It was either like the preamble to the Constitution or but the whole, these inalienable rights, all
Right.
that.
I'm almost
that
positive this is
language.
Declaration because I don't.
The preamble starts "We the people,"
Right.
so
I was
yeah.
like, this is either the second paragraph of the preamble or it's.
It's
the
Declaration
first.
of Independence.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Okay. It wouldn't make a ton of sense to, in your country's constitution, just start out by saying it's great to overthrow governments, and we're going to establish one. But yeah, no, definitely a pretty boss move to cite the Declaration of Independence and be like, yeah, we're doing that. We kind of think what y'all have going on is pretty fucked up, and we're going to do our own damn thing.
If it was fair for the founding fathers, it's fair for the Black Panther Party.
Yeah, and I mean, like liberalism as a whole, it does sound kind of nice. You're like, ooh, yeah, all men are created equal. That's sick. Yeah, I like that. And then you look at the reality of liberalism, and you're like, Jesus Christ, that is definitely not how you guys behave. You behave like people are anything but equal.
Yeah, it's in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right. Sweet. Yeah, I mean, the demand for number 10, land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and people's community control of modern technology. It's kind of just everything else that wasn't mentioned in the first 9 points, to kind of round out this vision that Huey had of, basically his idea of, a people's liberation movement. So, yeah, those are the 10 points. Let's see. I don't even remember when we started. Okay, we're at the 45-minute mark. That's pretty solid. All right, any other thoughts from everybody? Anybody have any takeaways from the text that they'd like to share? Now is the time.
Yeah. This technically does take. I am taking information that isn't from this, but adding on to it here. This is understandable to why there was actually a offshoot of the Black Panthers called the White Panthers that mainly consisted of white allies. I can see why it would be so appealing because, as you said before, as you were saying, we needed to make our words more appealing to the average person. They did that in this. And I wouldn't have any doubt that that is the reason why the White Panthers existed. I don't know if they still exist or don't, but either way, it does show that in practice, making words that really appealing to generally just more down to earth words such as just wanting actually public and essentially free healthcare for folks, and not only that but appealing to justice as well. That most definitely gives people, especially those radical liberals those radical young liberals within college, definitely during the time of the Black Panthers, that most definitely helped get more of them onto their side.
Sort of building off what you said, I think the existence of a White Panther Party or people adopting Black Panther Party techniques who were not a part of the Black Panthers, whether they were like the Young Socialists of America, who were a college group, kind of like what you described, it demonstrates that the Black Panthers were building class consciousness. They were reaching out, and their ideas, although insular to a Black community, uh, did spread class consciousness and did lift everyone up around them, as evidenced by the school breakfast program that they started.
Yeah, one of Huey's insights in the book kind of revolves around his thinking of he refers to basically his brothers on the block, right? And he's basically a lot of these guys are kind of ripe for radicalization, right? Like, they all kind of understand the system's fucked, and that the country and its institutions are insanely racist. Like, they know all this. None of this is news, right? But they're very they're so focused on just day-to-day struggle for survival, mostly due to whether it's just maybe they're in an impoverished situation or they're just working, and I think working takes up to half of your waking day, and then the other half might be taking care of family or your community or something, and poof, you're your life is basically just consumed by just survival and day-to-day living. That's not getting to another. It's hard to get to that upper one step beyond that, where you get to like community organizing and agitation and more like open struggle. And yeah, it's a very interesting perspective on. I know some people will point to the Black Panther Party as an example of like, an attempt to organize the quote unquote lumpen proletariat, right? I think that's, yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm sure if you want to get really technical, that, like, sure, that might be true. But it does sound like a lot of members were also just regular working people, also. They just so happen to be a fairly radical group. But that's the beauty of, I think, the party is that their message is actually their program is pretty fucking radical. It was back then, and it kind of still is today. Like, I mean, if your typical lib off the street would read this and be like, "Wow, was this written by fucking the evil dictator of Russia, Karl Marx, or something?" And you're like, "Yeah, totally, dude." No, it was written by a dude from Oakland, like a totally normal dude from Oakland. That's what's like crazy about it. Now, obviously, Huey was reading Marxist literature, so he knew he would have been very familiar with the actual theory, but he kind of understood. Yeah, you gotta like filter it in such a way that an average person who hasn't been exposed to any of that can read this 10-point program in like a pamphlet style. They're gonna read it once and they're gonna say, "Yep, that all makes sense. I agree." Most human beings probably agree with 90% of it, just on first glance, right? And so, yeah, I think that's why the party was so successful, especially in its early days before it started getting fucked with, honestly, by sort of the COINTEL programs. Or I guess that's a redundant, just COINTELPRO, which counterintelligence programs. So pro's already in there, but yeah, before the party started sort of fizzling out, like during its heyday, it's pretty impressive like how successful it was, and and they didn't really use a lot of the traditional Marxist language, and yet they're very much a Marxist program.
The sad thing is that, the one that like really like hurt like the Black Panthers, defense of black communities from cops. It was anti-gun legislation passed under the governorship of Ronald Reagan. Before he became president, he was still fucking with people.
Oh yeah,
That was the Mulford Act.
Reagan cut his teeth on squashing a lot of the radical movements in California during the late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Mulford Act was also supported by the NRA, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Wonder how they'd react nowadays.
They've supported like anti-gun legislation even recently, like bump stocks. They've supported because it was Republicans that backed it. Like you're for zero gun control, but you do it when it's convenient.
And
I thought it was pretty interesting to see in the book how figures that like from today how they interacted with each other, like the parts where Huey was speaking about his interactions with Kwame Ture. At the time, I think he was referring to Miss Stokely, and their general disagreements. How Huey had like a more class-minded application, but Kwame was more of like a hardline race interpretation. I thought it was pretty interesting to see like these people who like now you look at them as historical figures, like having direct interactions with each other and disagreements. The other thing thought was kind of interesting was how he talked about Eldridge Cleaver coming in and how he right off the bat was basically saying like he kind of seemed like an opportunist, and I hadn't
Yep.
learned anything about him, but I went and Googled. I don't know if anyone found this out or already knew this, but like he became like an organizer for the Republican Party.
Oh my god.
Like he
Yeah.
was like, oh, I love Ronald Reagan. So he was like spot on with that. So yeah.
That just sounds like class trade, not just class trader, but race trader territory. Ugh.
Yeah, Cleaver was a pretty textbook example of opportunism, where he kind of talked the talk, but as soon as they're like, okay, sweet, we're going to start walking the walk, he's like, wait, what? Nah, I'm out of here.
And also, I actually remembered a quote from Fred Hampton that really pretty much exemplifies everything within this. Would you mind me reading it off?
Go for it.
All right. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism. We're going to fight it with socialism. We're stood up and said we're not going to fight reactionary pigs and reactionary states attorneys like this, and reactionary states attorneys like Hanrahan with any other reactions on our part. We're going to fight the reactions with all of us people getting together and having an international proletariat revolution. End quote.
Yeah, Fred Hampton was fucking sick.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they freaking was the Chicago Police Department, I think, just straight up executed him, and I think it was like him and one other person at least, or maybe more than one person from their chapter. But yeah, that was one of the more like overt. The police were just like, yeah, we're just gonna go in and literally kill everyone. Like they were just straight up fucking.
They wrote it down. They were like, we plan to go in there and shoot him.
Yeah, it was literally like a take no prisoners, like shoot to kill situation, which is, yeah, I mean they're pretty much acting like an occupation, like an occupational military force, and they're like, yep, we need to take out this insurgent. Basically the same exact methodology.
But I don't think that was like unique or new as the Black Panther Party emerged. I think they were doing that already in Oakland, and it resulted in the Black Panther Party.
Well, there wasn't much. I don't know if there was any like serious organizations that threatened the police like the Black Panthers did, though. All right, because their program was like they were trying to they're antagonizing police, not in a way to like incite shootouts. That was not their objective, but to show the police like, hey, you're not the only ones with power here, bub. Like, our community has its own. We can express our own sort of power.
I know there was like a lot of internal argument over stuff like that because they're like, should we be dressing in military fatigues and carrying guns around publicly? And everybody's like, we're not villains. We don't want to scare our own community away. And they were like, but we also don't want to be, look like we're not intimidated by police or whatever. So they were back and forth on that. And I think they eventually just settled on using like certain like clothing.
I wouldn't even. Going back a little bit to Grade A's point. I don't think that the Black Panther Party was particularly antagonistic to the police. I would say more that they were effective against the police in ways that other organizations were not. And that's part of what sparked the confrontation. Because previously the police could just kill or beat up or arrest whoever they wanted until there was an effective means of organization.
Yeah,
I think being armed too definitely.
right.
made
I think that's sort of how he put it. Right, is that he basically said like our goal isn't to like get up in the police's face with weapons and like incite anything. I think his interpretation was like, even though these activities that we're going to do are 100% legal, like doing patrols on their own with their own weapons, looking for or making sure police weren't fucking with people. Even though all of that is totally legal, because it's kind of similar to what police do, he basically just correctly assumed the police would take it very poorly and they would interpret it as antagonism, which of course they did, right? Because they're basically like, hey,
And
you're doing,
still
you're
do.
doing, yeah, and it's like, right? They're basically like, hey, you're doing what we do, except you are not an occupational force. They are just members of their own community. They're patrolling their own community. Whereas the police, the police know, even though they might not say it, they understand that they are an occupation force in pretty much almost every situation, right? Like they understand what the deal is.
If you see how the police respond to being filmed, which is a legal, constitutionally protected activity, there's thousands and thousands of videos on YouTube of the police being filmed and the police injuring people, retaliating people, following people home, like everything that you would do as an occupational force if you were being observed being abusive and degrading the community.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're talking about when we say like their activity was perceived as very antagonistic by the police, which is not shocking, but yeah, their goal wasn't like to just do shootouts constantly.
No, I get the impression that their goal was just to go like, okay, let's make the police abide by the standards that the police have set for themselves.
Yeah,
and
in
protect
some
those.
way, yeah, in some ways that's true, right? And that's honestly, I think the Black Panthers are a really excellent example where, whether you're if you ever have like a discussion with folks about either police abolition or prison abolition, which is very, very much in the same thread, right? They're kind of parallel. A lot of people have that gut instinct reaction to be like, well, wait, there has to be something like police. Like, there has to be something like them that sort of enforce whatever. And because, again, like, people are very heavily indoctrinated into, like, the idea of police and prisons always lurking in the background, like ready to pounce on you if you make a mistake or break a rule or a law. And you can point to us like something like Black Panthers, where you're like, listen, I think communities are perfectly capable of quote unquote policing themselves or just taking care of their own business, right? Like if there's someone who's in your community who's like fucking around, making people's lives hell or committing crimes, like people are gonna fucking figure it out and hopefully can take care of it themselves. They don't need an external force to come in and like whoop ass.
I know this is a bit self-flagellating, you could say, but I think that a good example is a community like this one. We don't need cops to organize a group of people that is their sole job is to protect the community from bad actors or, creepy weirdos on Discord. We just organized around a group of people who have the authority to eject those people. And the same thing can be done for any given community, be it online or not. And I think that is a thing that naturally arises.
Yeah, and as long as somebody doesn't have like a disproportionate amount of power or resources, like capitalist or monarchist hierarchies, if somebody doesn't have those resources, then the community is perfectly capable of protecting itself and enforcing its codes of behavior.
Yeah, and even you can also use the historical argument, which is that human society has existed so much longer without cops than with cops, and we're still here, so we can very much live without them. There's abundant evidence of this.
Even current evidence, if you're in the U.S., like I think it was Minnesota has less cops and less crime
Funny how that
as
works.
of this year. Uh,
I think
Minnesota represent.
the national police budget is, if it was like if the U.S. police force was a military, it'd be like the third largest military in the world, right after like U.S. and China. Which means you should have a crime rate of 0, right? Like if it's the largest police force in the world, and that's just not the case.
Technically, that that statistic also kind of counts China in a very weird way. If you were to do like a much more like accurate assessment of the United States police force, I'm pretty sure it's number 2. Because yeah, again, the way they count China's military budget versus the United States military budget is a little bit skewed.
I think I also saw something where it was like the New York Police Department in and of itself would be like 12 in the world.
Yep. I think like what, $2 billion a year, I think.
Goddamn.
Yeah, that's or no, it might have even been as high as 6 billion. It's in the single digit billions, the New York City Police Department. And that's New York City, not New York State.
Couldn't that amount of money help with like?
I mean, you
literally
don't
solve all
I
the
was gonna
problems
say
that the
you could
police are
pretty
there
much.
to
The
prevent.
answer to that is yes. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what you're about
Anything
to
else.
say; it would help anywhere but the police.
Right.
But I mean, you ask somebody else that, you're like, why do they need a police budget? And like the only answer to that is just like they're just genetically more violent, I guess. Which, Americans might be. I don't know.
I mean,
It's social conditions. It's not.
There's
I
also like
would
that rare category of like weirdly class conscious, but like still bourgeois thinking, where they're like, "Yeah, we need more police to oppress all the poor people, so we protect property." It's like I've unironically heard someone just be like, "Yeah, that's the reason we need more police," and it's like, well, at least you're honest. At least you kind of understand what's going on. You're just a shithead. That's all.
I prefer my reactionaries to be honest with me.
Yeah.
It makes it easier to figure out who to shoot.
Yeah, and well, they get the libs all riled up, like, oh yeah, no, we need cops. We need cops to be our vice president. We need cops to, create a slave labor force. It's awful though.
All right. Well, I'm gonna call the recording there. We can obviously keep going, but I'll call it there.
Sure.